Raspberry Pi launched the 2GB Pi 5 for $50, and besides half the RAM and a lower price, it has a new stepping on the main BCM2712 chip. This is the BCM2712 D0 stepping. Older Pi 5s shipped with a C1. In their blog post, they said the new D0 stepping strips away all that unneeded functionality, leaving only the bits we need. Steppings are basically chip revisions where they don't change functionality and usually just fix bugs or tweak the layout. But even tiny design changes could have unintended consequences. I wanted to see exactly what happens when I push one of these new chips to the limits. First, I wanted a performance baseline, so I ran Geekbench with the latest Pi OS and all the defaults, except apparently Geekbench likes more than 2 gigs of RAM. I couldn't get past the multi-core photo filter test since the OS kept running out of memory. A lot of software nowadays is built for an absolute minimum of 4 or 8 gigs, so keep that in mind when you're buying a Pi. Without adding swap, Geekbench was out, but I still wanted to get some raw numbers, so I ran Sysbench. It's lighter weight, it runs with limited memory, and it still gives me CPU numbers to compare. At the default 2.4 gig clock, I got 4155 events per second. I started overclocking the chip, and of course I slapped on this comically large Peltier cooler. Something like this would be terrible for a modern Intel CPU, but it has a ton of cooling capacity for a chip that only has a few watts. Overclocked to 3 GHz, I got 5175 events per second. At 3.1, 5315. And at 3.2, I could get 5505, but it started having memory errors and a kernel panic after a benchmark run. I wanted to keep going further, so I pulled out my Pi overvolt hack and patched the Pi's firmware. If you want to do this, go check out my older video on overclocking the Pi 5 to the extreme. But like I said then, if you use this hack, you'll void your Pi's warranty. You've been warned. With the overvolt, I could get 5715 at 3.3 GHz, 3.4 got me 5804, but when I tried rebooting, the Pi locked up in the middle of shutdown, so 3.4 GHz was the limit with just the Peltier. I plonked the EdaTech bottom heatsink on and cranked up my big Noctua fan to the max, and that was enough to push 3.4 GHz, breaking the 6,000 events per second barrier. When I tried pushing 3.6 GHz, the Pi would just freeze with a bunch of kernel errors, so I think that's my new limit, at least without hacking the hardware. On the 4GB Pi 5, I gave up at 3.5 GHz. Here, it looked like I'd have to stop at 3.6, but last time I didn't try my last trick, delidding the chip for direct die cooling. Theoretically, the cooler could pull heat off the silicon even faster, but there was another reason I wanted to delid a 2GB Pi 5. Like I said earlier, Raspberry Pi in their blog post said the D0 stepping was simpler and cheaper to make since they removed dark silicon. That just means there were portions of the BCM2712 that Broadcom put in, but Raspberry Pi never used, like the built-in Ethernet controller. Raspberry Pi built their own Ethernet into the RP1 so they don't wind up using the controller in the main SoC. What this means for the D0 is the actual CPU die is smaller. A smaller die fits more chips on a single wafer, meaning individual chips cost less, assuming the chip production yields are the same. And I already have a delidded C1 chip from back when I worked with John McMaster and Kleindeek on my Pi 5 silicon video, so I just need to delid the D0 chip. So I popped off the cooler and was only slightly alarmed at the sight of water puddling under the cooler while the Pi was powered on. I brought the Pi over to the workbench and started going at it with a razor blade. Now, while I'm doing that, I'll also tell you about today's sponsor, Surfshark. Thanks to them, I was able to buy a few Pi 5 2GB models for testing, like the one you see on the bench. While I'm prying away at the metal heat spreader, someone else is prying away your private data. Governments, advertisers, ISPs, and websites. And Surfshark has tools that can help you with privacy. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that I only use Surfshark, or using Surfshark will magically make everything untraceable or anything like that. I use a private VPN here in my office for remote access when I'm working on my projects, but I also use Surfshark a lot. Like last year when I was in London, I was amazed how many sites I used in the US that just block out-of-country access. I used Surfshark to make it look like I was back in the US, and they have thousands of servers around the world, so you can use them when you need to get past a lot of the silly geo restrictions. They also have some other identity protection and privacy guard services like Surfshark Alert. And you know what? They do a lot better job of protecting things than this little heat spreader, which after a little pressure popped right off. If you want to try Surfshark, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Secure your privacy with Surfshark. Enter coupon code RedShirtJeff for 4 months extra at surfshark.com/RedShirtJeff. It's funny though, Raspberry Pi said they were removing the dark silicon, but it looks like this new silicon is still pretty dark. But measuring the D0, it's actually 32.5% smaller than the older version. It's 6.3 by 5.98 millimeters compared to the old one at 6.47 by 8.63. So that would definitely bring down the price per chip since you could fit a bunch more of these on a wafer. Apparently, Pi 5 sales are strong enough they spent the money to optimize this Pi-only version of the chip. Or maybe Raspberry Pi realized they're going to need tons more for new products like the CM5. Anyway, that's the new chip. I put down more thermal pads on the PMIC and the memory chip, but I was having some issues. I couldn't get 3.6 GHz, and I was also starting to see less stability at 3.5. There were more memory errors like this one, but I also noticed the temperature was still around the upper 20s. I don't think removing the heat spreader helped all that much. And just for fun, I pulled off the cooler entirely and let the Pi run with just the die exposed to the air. It was actually happy running like this, and comparing what I was seeing on my thermal camera to the Pi, the 35 degrees Celsius the Pi reported looked pretty accurate. So could you run a Pi completely naked like this? Sure, I guess, but the heat spreader does a good job getting more heat off the whole package, so I'd just leave it on unless you're gonna go all out with liquid nitrogen, which might be fun. But with the heat spreader removed, I kept getting lockups, so I'm gonna throw in the towel for now. There's another trick I might try, bypassing the 1.1 volt limit on the PMIC, but that'll wait for another day. I think the biggest takeaway is the Pi's 16 nanometer chip might just max out around 3.5 GHz. The other big question though is whether the smaller design is any better for efficiency or thermals. CNX Software did some testing and published this chart showing a significant difference. I haven't done exhaustive testing, but I did run through my stress benchmarks, monitoring power and heat. I ran it on all the Pi 5 models with identical test parameters. I have more in this GitHub issue, but this chart shows the bottom line. Interestingly, for idle power draw, the improvement almost mirrors the chip size reduction. The chip is 33% smaller and the idle power draw is about 30% better. That's honestly surprising, but a welcome surprise. And full tilt, the CPU is still almost a watt more efficient on the 2 gig Pi 5. Some of that could maybe be chalked up to less RAM because more RAM requires more power, but that doesn't explain all my results. Thomas Kaiser also found the op tables are different with the new chip. The 2 gig model doesn't need as much voltage to hit certain clocks, like it uses 805 millivolts at 2.1 GHz versus 850 for the 8 gig model. As a final efficiency test, I ran my top 500 HPL benchmark against the 2 gig Pi 5. HPL is a memory-intense benchmark, and because the 2 gig model only has 2 gigs of RAM, the overall efficiency for this test was worse, coming in at 2.07 gigaflops per watt. The 8 gig Pi 5 gets 2.75. But day to day, unless you're running off a battery or maxing out the RAM, it's not going to make a huge difference. It'd be nice to see the bigger models get this new chip though, because power savings is power savings. For now, the bigger difference for most people would still be having more RAM. If you know you can run your apps in 2 gigs, this is a great Pi for that. If you can't, then I think Raspberry Pi set up the 4 gig Pi 5 as the Goldilocks version. Not too expensive, with just enough RAM for most people. So is it worth stepping down to a 2 gig Pi 5 just to get the simpler D0 chip? No. But is it cooler to have a cheaper 2 gig option? Yes. Just make sure you have a use case for it that doesn't need a ton of RAM. Until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling.